The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle, as 8-year-old Prince George walked quietly beside his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II. It was a Tuesday in early spring, and the young prince had been invited to accompany her on one of her daily walks around the castle grounds. This was not unusual, as the Queen often enjoyed the company of her great-grandchildren during these peaceful moments. George held his grandmother's hand gently, his small fingers wrapped around hers as they walked past the ancient stone walls that had witnessed centuries of royal history. The Queen moved slowly but with dignity, her walking stick tapping softly against the cobblestones. At her age, these walks had become more precious to her, and she treasured the time spent with her family. As they approached the main entrance, George noticed a tall man in a red uniform standing perfectly still near the doorway. The guard's name was Thomas Wellington, though George didn't know this yet. Thomas had been serving as a Queen's Guard for nearly 15 years, and his dedication to duty was legendary among his peers. He stood with his shoulders back, his famous bearskin hat positioned perfectly, and his eyes fixed straight ahead as protocol demanded. Thomas had joined the Queen's Guard when he was just 22 years old, following in his father's footsteps. His father, Robert Wellington, had served the royal family for 30 years before retiring with honor. Growing up, Thomas had heard countless stories about the importance of serving the crown and protecting the royal family. It wasn't just a job for him, it was a calling that filled him with immense pride. The Queen and Prince George continued their walk, passing several other guards positioned around the castle. Each guard maintained their stoic pose, a tradition that had been upheld for generations. These men and women were trained to remain motionless for hours, regardless of weather conditions or distractions around them. They were the silent protectors of one of the world's oldest monarchies. Prince George had always been curious about the guards. During previous visits to his great-grandmother, he had often wondered what it would be like to stand so still for such long periods. His mother, Catherine, had explained to him that the guards were very brave people who protected the royal family, and that their job required great discipline and sacrifice. As they walked past Thomas, something caught Prince George's attention. While the guard maintained his perfect posture and forward gaze, George noticed something that others might have missed. There was a slight tremor in Thomas's hands, barely visible but present nonetheless. The young prince's sharp eyes also caught sight of what appeared to be a small tear rolling down the guard's cheek. George slowed his pace slightly, his curious nature getting the better of him. He had never seen a guard show any emotion before, and this small display of human feeling intrigued him. The Queen, sensing her great-grandson's hesitation, also slowed down but didn't say anything. She had learned over her many years that sometimes the most important lessons came from simply observing. Thomas, despite his training to ignore all distractions, was aware of the royal presence nearby. On this particular morning, he was struggling with personal challenges that seemed almost overwhelming. His wife Sarah had been diagnosed with a serious illness 3 months earlier, and the medical bills were mounting despite his steady income. Their 8-year-old daughter, Emma, had been asking why her mother was always tired and why Daddy seemed so worried all the time. The previous evening, Sarah had been admitted to the hospital again, and Thomas had spent most of the night at her bedside before reporting for duty. He had barely slept, and the emotional weight of watching his beloved wife suffer was taking its toll on him. Despite all of this, he had shown up for work because his sense of duty ran deep in his veins. Prince George continued to observe Thomas quietly, his young mind processing what he was seeing. Though he was only 8 years old, George had been raised with a strong sense of empathy and compassion. His parents had always taught him to be aware of others' feelings and to show kindness whenever possible. The Queen, following her great-grandson's gaze, also noticed the guard's emotional state. In her many decades of experience, she had developed an extraordinary ability to read people, and she could sense that this particular guard was experiencing something difficult. However, royal protocol prevented her from directly addressing the situation at that moment. As they completed their walk and prepared to head back inside, Prince George made a decision that would change everything. He gently tugged on his grandmother's hand and whispered something into her ear. The Queen listened carefully to what her great-grandson had to say, her expression showing both surprise and admiration for the young boy's thoughtfulness. Thomas remained at his post, unaware that his brief moment of vulnerability had been witnessed by two of the most important people in the kingdom. He continued to stand guard, fighting back his emotions and trying to focus on his duties despite the personal storm raging in his heart. The morning continued as usual for most people at the castle, but something significant had been set in motion. Prince George's observation and subsequent conversation with his grandmother would soon lead to an extraordinary chain of events that would touch the hearts of everyone involved and demonstrate the power of compassion across social boundaries as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting new patterns of light and shadow across the ancient stones of Windsor Castle. None of the participants in this unfolding drama could have predicted how this simple morning walk would transform all of their lives. The stage was set for an act of kindness so pure and genuine that it would resonate far beyond the castle walls and remind everyone involved of the fundamental humanity that connects us all, regardless of our positions in life. After their walk, Prince George couldn't stop thinking about the guard with tears in his eyes. While his grandmother attended to her royal duties, George found himself drawn to one of the castle windows that overlooked the courtyard, where Thomas Wellington continued his watch. The young prince pressed his face against the cool glass, watching the guard who stood as still as a statue despite whatever was troubling him. Prince George had been raised with stories about duty, service, and the importance of caring for others. His parents, Prince William and Catherine, had always emphasized that being royal came with the responsibility to help people, especially those who were struggling. These lessons had shaped George's young character, making him more observant and empathetic than many children his age. During lunch with his great-grandmother, George found it difficult to concentrate on his meal. The Queen, with her years of wisdom and experience reading people, noticed her great-grandson's distraction. She had seen many things in her long life, but she was particularly moved by young George's genuine concern for someone he had never even spoken to. "Gangan," George said, using his special name for the Queen. The guard outside looked very sad. "Do you think something bad happened to him?" His innocent question carried a weight that touched the Queen's heart. Here was a young boy who could have anything he wanted in the world, yet he was worried about a stranger's pain. The Queen set down her teacup and looked at her great-grandson thoughtfully. "Sometimes, George, people carry heavy burdens that we cannot see. The guards who protect us are people too, with families and worries just like everyone else. What do you think we should do when we notice someone is hurting?" George considered this question seriously, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Maybe we could help them? Or at least let them know that someone cares." His response demonstrated a maturity beyond his years and filled the Queen with pride. She realized that this young boy truly understood what it meant to be a compassionate leader. Meanwhile, Thomas Wellington continued his duty outside, fighting an internal battle between his professional obligations and his personal anguish. His mind kept drifting to the hospital room where his wife Sarah lay recovering from another round of treatment. The doctors had been optimistic, but the road ahead remained uncertain and expensive. Thomas had always been a private person, preferring to handle his problems without burdening others. His military training had taught him to be strong and self-reliant, but the current situation was testing every limit he had. The other guards had noticed his recent subdued demeanor, but the culture of stoic silence made it difficult for anyone to reach out or offer support. During his brief lunch break, Thomas called the hospital to check on Sarah. The nurse informed him that she was stable but would need to remain for observation for several more days. The medical bills continued to mount, and despite his decent salary as a Queen's Guard, the specialized treatment required was straining their family finances to the breaking point. His daughter Emma had been staying with her grandparents while her mother was hospitalized, but Thomas knew she was confused and frightened by the situation. At 8 years old, she was too young to fully understand what was happening, but old enough to sense that something was seriously wrong. Thomas felt torn between his duty to the crown and his desperate desire to be with his family during this crisis. After lunch, the Queen made an unusual request to her private secretary. She asked for a complete but discreet background check on Guard Thomas Wellington. This was not typical protocol, but the Queen's staff had learned over the decades to trust her judgment completely. When the Queen took a special interest in someone, it usually meant something important was developing. Prince George spent the afternoon in the castle's library, but his attention was not on his books. Instead, he kept glancing out the windows toward where the guards were stationed. His young mind was working on a problem that seemed too big for his age, but his heart was telling him that something needed to be done. The Queen's private secretary returned with Thomas's file by late afternoon. The report revealed a dedicated soldier with an exemplary service record, no disciplinary issues, and consistent praise from his superior officers. However, a discreet inquiry had also revealed the current family crisis that Thomas was facing. The Queen read the information with growing concern and admiration for the guard who continued to perform his duties despite such personal hardship. As evening approached, Prince George made a decision that would surprise everyone around him. He approached his great-grandmother with a carefully thought-out plan. "Gangan," he said with unusual seriousness, "I want to do something special for the sad guard. Can you help me?" The Queen listened as George explained his idea with the earnestness that only a child could possess. His plan was simple yet profound, and it demonstrated an understanding of human dignity and compassion that impressed even someone with the Queen's vast experience. She realized that her great-grandson was proposing something that could have a lasting impact, not just on the guard, but on everyone who witnessed it. Thomas completed his evening shift as usual, but the weight of his personal situation seemed heavier than ever. As he prepared to leave the castle and return to his empty home, he had no idea that his life was about to change in a way he could never have imagined. The royal family had taken notice of his situation, and young Prince George was preparing to demonstrate that true nobility comes not from titles or crowns, but from the size of one's heart and the willingness to reach out to others in their time of need. The evening sun cast long shadows across Windsor Castle as the stage was set for an extraordinary act of kindness that would bridge the gap between royalty and common folk, proving that compassion knows no social boundaries. The next morning arrived with a gentle mist covering the grounds of Windsor Castle. Thomas Wellington reported for duty as usual, though the sleepless night at the hospital had left dark circles under his eyes. Sarah had experienced complications during the night, and while she was now stable, the doctors needed to run additional tests that would extend her stay and increase their mounting medical expenses. Thomas took his position at the main entrance. Putting on his professional mask, despite the turmoil in his heart, he had received a call from his daughter Emma the night before, asking when Mommy would come home and why he couldn't be there to tuck her in. Those innocent questions had pierced his heart more deeply than any physical wound ever could. Inside the castle, Prince George woke earlier than usual, his mind already focused on the plan he had discussed with his great-grandmother. The Queen had been moved by her great-grandson's genuine desire to help, and together they had refined his idea into something truly special. What impressed the Queen most was that George's plan wasn't about giving money or expensive gifts, but about offering something far more precious: recognition, respect, and human dignity. After breakfast, the Queen called for a private meeting with Colonel James Morrison, the commanding officer responsible for the castle guards. This was an unusual request, as such meetings typically went through multiple layers of protocol. Colonel Morrison, a distinguished veteran with 30 years of military service, wondered what could prompt such a direct summons from Her Majesty. "Colonel Morrison," the Queen began as they sat in her private study, "I understand you have a guard named Thomas Wellington in your command. Can you tell me about him?" The colonel was initially puzzled by this specific inquiry, but responded professionally, praising Thomas's dedication, reliability, and exemplary service record. The Queen listened carefully as Colonel Morrison described Thomas as one of his most dependable guards, someone who had never missed a shift and consistently demonstrated the highest standards of military bearing. "Your Majesty, if I may ask, has Guard Wellington done something to attract your attention?" the colonel inquired respectfully. "Yes," the Queen replied thoughtfully. "He has shown extraordinary dedication to duty under what I understand are very difficult personal circumstances. My great-grandson Prince George noticed his distress yesterday, and it has prompted us to consider how we might acknowledge such devoted service." Colonel Morrison was astounded. In his many years of military service, he had rarely seen such direct royal interest in an individual guard. He confirmed what the Queen already knew about Thomas's situation. The family medical crisis that was testing the young father's resolve while he continued to fulfill his duties without complaint. Meanwhile, Prince George was in the castle's art room, working on a special project with the help of his art teacher. He was creating something with his own hands, pouring his 8-year-old heart into every careful stroke. The project was simple but meaningful. A hand-drawn card with a message that had taken him considerable time to compose in his neat, careful handwriting. Thomas continued his morning watch, unaware that his life was about to intersect with royalty in an unprecedented way. During his brief break, he checked his phone and found a message from Sarah's doctor, requesting a meeting to discuss additional treatment options. The weight of responsibility felt crushing as he realized that his wife needed care that might be beyond their financial means. As he returned to his post, Thomas noticed unusual activity around the castle. Staff members seemed to be preparing for something, though he couldn't determine what. Royal residences often hosted various ceremonies and events, so unusual activity wasn't particularly noteworthy, but something felt different about today's preparations. Prince George had finished his special project and was now working with the castle's kitchen staff on another element of his plan. The young prince had requested that they prepare a simple care package, nothing elaborate or expensive, but items that might provide comfort to someone going through a difficult time. His choices were thoughtful and practical: homemade soup, fresh bread, tea, and some of his own favorite biscuits. The Queen watched her great-grandson's preparations with growing admiration. At only 8 years old, George was demonstrating leadership qualities that couldn't be taught in any classroom. His natural inclination toward service and compassion reminded her of the best aspects of royal duty: the responsibility to care for and uplift others. As the afternoon approached, the Queen made another unusual decision. She requested that the castle's photographer be available to document what was about to happen, though she instructed that the photos were to remain private unless the family involved gave permission for their release. This wasn't about publicity or public relations. It was about preserving a moment of genuine human connection. Thomas noticed that his commanding officer, Colonel Morrison, was observing the guards more closely than usual that day. The colonel had been quietly impressed by the Queen's inquiry about Thomas and had taken the opportunity to personally observe the guard who had captured royal attention. What he saw confirmed everything he had told Her Majesty: a professional soldier maintaining his duties despite obvious personal strain. As the day progressed, word spread quietly among the castle staff about the young prince's initiative. Many had served the royal family for years, but they had never witnessed anything quite like what was being planned. The combination of Prince George's pure-hearted compassion and the Queen's support for his idea created an atmosphere of anticipation and respect throughout the castle. Thomas remained unaware of the extraordinary day that was unfolding around him. His focus was split between his professional duties and his worries about Sarah's condition and their family's uncertain future. He had no way of knowing that his silent struggle had touched the heart of a young prince and set in motion events that would restore his faith in human kindness and change his perspective on service forever. The stage was now set for an encounter that would demonstrate the true meaning of nobility and prove that sometimes the smallest gestures can have the most profound impact on human lives. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the courtyard when the moment finally arrived. Prince George, dressed in his neat casual clothes, walked slowly toward the main entrance where Thomas Wellington stood at his post. The young prince carried a small wicker basket in his hands, and his expression showed a mixture of determination and nervousness. The Queen followed at a respectful distance, accompanied by Colonel Morrison and a small group of castle staff who had gathered to witness this unprecedented event. Word had spread quietly among those who worked at Windsor Castle, and many were curious to see what the young prince had planned. However, they all maintained a professional distance, understanding that this was a deeply personal moment. Thomas noticed the approaching group but maintained his rigid posture and forward gaze as protocol demanded. Guards were trained to remain focused on their duties regardless of royal presence, and Thomas's military discipline was so ingrained that he continued his watch despite sensing that something unusual was happening around him. Prince George stopped directly in front of Thomas, looking up at the tall guard with his earnest 8-year-old eyes. For a moment, the young prince seemed to gather his courage, understanding somehow that what he was about to do was significant. The basket in his hands contained the items he had carefully selected: the homemade soup, fresh bread, tea, biscuits, and the hand-drawn card he had created with such care. "Excuse me, sir," Prince George said in his clear, polite voice. Thomas's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but the young prince continued with remarkable composure. "I noticed yesterday that you seemed very sad, and I wanted to let you know that someone cares about you and your family." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow, but not from pain, from pure, overwhelming emotion. In his 15 years of service, no member of the royal family had ever addressed him directly about personal matters. The fact that this child had noticed his distress and cared enough to act on it was almost too much to process while maintaining his professional composure. Prince George carefully placed the basket at Thomas's feet, making sure not to interfere with the guard's stance or duties. "My great-grandmother told me that you have a wife who is sick and a little girl who misses you. I have a card for you, and some food that might help. The soup is from our kitchen. Cook says it makes everything better." Thomas felt tears welling up in his eyes, but his training kept him staring straight ahead. However, his hands began to tremble slightly, and those observing could see the emotional impact of the young prince's words. The queen watched with pride as her great-grandson handled this delicate moment with wisdom beyond his years. "I know you can't talk to me right now because you're working," Prince George continued, "but I wanted you to know that you're very brave. Taking care of your family and protecting us at the same time must be really hard. I think you're a hero." Colonel Morrison, who had been skeptical about this unusual breach of protocol, found himself deeply moved by what he was witnessing. In all his years of military service, he had never seen such a pure expression of gratitude and recognition for a soldier's sacrifice. The young prince was demonstrating leadership qualities that many adults never developed. Prince George reached into the basket and carefully extracted the hand-drawn card he had created. The front showed a simple drawing of a guard in his red uniform standing tall and proud, with a crown drawn above his head to show that he was protecting royalty. Inside, in George's careful 8-year-old handwriting, was a message that would change Thomas's life forever. "Dear Guard," the card read, "thank you for keeping my family safe every day. I'm sorry your wife is sick and I hope she gets better soon. You don't have to be strong all the time. Sometimes even heroes need help. Your friend, Prince George. P.S. My mummy says prayers help, so I'm praying for your family." Prince George placed the card gently on top of the other items in the basket, and then did something that surprised everyone present. He stepped back and gave Thomas a formal, respectful salute, the kind he had learned from watching military ceremonies. It was a gesture of respect from one person of service to another, acknowledging the guard's dedication and sacrifice. The queen approached slowly, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of experience and genuine emotion. "Guard Wellington," she said formally, "your service to the crown has been exemplary, but your service to your family during these difficult times has been truly remarkable. It takes extraordinary character to maintain your duties while facing personal challenges of this magnitude." For the first time since the encounter began, Thomas's military bearing wavered slightly. A single tear rolled down his cheek as he continued to maintain his forward gaze. But everyone present could see the profound impact of these words. The queen continued, "You have the gratitude of the entire royal family, and please know that we are aware of your sacrifice." Prince George looked up at his great-grandmother, and then back at Thomas. "I hope your wife gets better soon, and I hope your little girl knows how lucky she is to have such a brave daddy," he said, with the sincerity that only a child could possess. The group began to move away, leaving Thomas alone with the basket of gifts and the weight of what had just occurred. As soon as they were out of sight, Thomas's composure finally broke. Tears flowed freely down his face as he looked down at the basket, containing these precious gifts from a young prince who had noticed his pain and cared enough to act. Colonel Morrison had witnessed something that would change his entire perspective on leadership and compassion. The Queen had seen her great-grandson demonstrate the true meaning of royal duty, and Prince George had learned that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can have the most profound impact on another person's life. Thomas reached down carefully and picked up the card, reading the young prince's message through his tears. In that moment, he realized that his service had been truly seen and valued, not just as a guard performing duties, but as a human being facing challenges with courage and dedication. That evening, Thomas Wellington sat in his modest flat, still in uniform but with the basket from Prince George placed carefully on his small dining table. The card lay open beside it, and he had read the young prince's message at least a dozen times. Each reading brought fresh tears and a sense of wonder that he was still struggling to process. His phone rang, interrupting his contemplation. It was his mother-in-law calling from the hospital where she had been sitting with Sarah. "Thomas, dear, you need to get here quickly," she said, but her tone carried excitement rather than alarm. "Sarah's awake and asking for you, and the doctor has some good news about her test results." Thomas grabbed his keys and drove to the hospital faster than he probably should have, his mind racing between hope and fear. When he arrived at Sarah's room, he found her sitting up in bed looking more alert than she had in weeks. The doctor was there with a genuine smile on his face, and for the first time in months, Thomas allowed himself to feel a spark of real hope. "Mr. Wellington," the doctor said, "the latest tests show that your wife is responding much better to the treatment than we initially expected. The new medication regime seems to be working, and while we're not out of the woods yet, the prognosis is significantly more optimistic than it was even yesterday." Sarah reached for Thomas's hand, squeezing it with more strength than she had shown in weeks. "Tell me about your day," she said with a weak but genuine smile. "You look like something wonderful happened." Thomas sat beside her bed and, with tears in his eyes, told her about Prince George's incredible gesture. He showed her the card and described every detail of the encounter, from the young prince's sincere words to the Queen's acknowledgement of his service. Sarah listened with amazement, holding the hand-drawn card as if it were made of gold. "That little boy saw your pain and chose to act on it," Sarah whispered. "Do you realize how special that is? In a world where most people look the other way, a prince noticed your struggle and decided to help." Meanwhile, back at Windsor Castle, Prince George was having dinner with his great-grandmother. The Queen had been thinking about the afternoon's events and was struck by how naturally her great-grandson had handled such a complex situation. "George," she said, "what you did today was remarkable. How did you know what to say to guard Wellington?" Prince George considered the question seriously while cutting his vegetables. "I just thought about how I would feel if Mummy was sick and Daddy had to work all the time and couldn't be with us. I would want someone to notice and care about us. And I remembered you always saying that being royal means helping people when we can." The Queen smiled with deep satisfaction. Here was proof that the values she and the entire family had worked to instill in the young prince were taking root in beautiful ways. "You demonstrated true leadership today, George. Not because of your title, but because of your character." Colonel Morrison, meanwhile, was in his office writing what would become one of the most unusual reports of his military career. How does one officially document a royal child's act of kindness that moved a seasoned soldier to tears? He decided to focus on the positive impact it would likely have on morale among all the guards, who would certainly hear about Prince George's gesture. The next morning brought surprising developments. Thomas reported for duty as usual, but he carried himself differently. The emotional burden that had weighed him down for months seemed lighter, not because his problems had disappeared, but because he felt genuinely supported and appreciated. His fellow guards noticed the change immediately. Word of Prince George's gesture had spread among the castle staff and guards, though everyone understood the sensitivity of the situation and respected the family's privacy. However, the impact on morale was immediate and powerful. Guards who had been performing their duties mechanically for years suddenly felt seen and valued as human beings, not just uniformed figures. During his lunch break, Thomas received a call that would change everything. A representative from the Royal Benevolent Fund, a charity that assists royal household employees and their families during times of crisis, had somehow learned about his situation. They were calling to inform him that an anonymous donor wanted to help with his family's medical expenses. Thomas was initially skeptical, wondering if this was some kind of mistake or scam. However, when he met with the fund's representative later that day, he learned that this was completely legitimate. The anonymous donation would cover not only Sarah's current medical bills, but would also establish a fund to help with any future treatment she might need. "I can't tell you who the donor is," the representative explained, "but I can say that they were moved by your story and wanted to ensure that your family could focus on healing rather than worrying about finances." Thomas suspected that the royal family might be behind this extraordinary generosity, though he had no way to confirm it. What mattered more was that the crushing financial pressure that had been suffocating his family was suddenly lifted, allowing them to concentrate on what really mattered: Sarah's recovery and their life together. That evening, Thomas called his daughter Emma, who was still staying with her grandparents. For the first time in months, he was able to tell her that Mommy was getting better and that Daddy would be able to visit more often. The joy in his 8-year-old daughter's voice reminded him why all of his sacrifices were worthwhile. As he hung up the phone, Thomas looked again at Prince George's card, which he had framed and placed on his mantel. The simple drawing of a guard and the heartfelt words from a child had somehow opened doors to hope and healing that he never could have imagined. The gesture had been small and personal, but its impact was transforming his entire world. At Windsor Castle, Prince George was already asleep, unaware of the ripple effects his simple act of kindness was creating in Thomas Wellington's life. The Queen sat in her study, reflecting on the day's events and feeling profound pride in her great-grandson's natural instincts toward compassion and service. 2 weeks had passed since Prince George's extraordinary gesture, and the positive changes in Thomas Wellington's life continued to unfold. Sarah's health was improving steadily, and the doctors were cautiously optimistic about her long-term prognosis. The financial stress that had been crushing their family was gone, thanks to the anonymous donation, and Thomas found himself able to be present emotionally for his family in ways he hadn't been able to manage in months. However, the experience had also led Thomas to some deep soul-searching about his future. As he stood at his post each day, he found himself thinking not just about his duties as a guard, but about the broader meaning of service and how he could best contribute to the world. The young prince's gesture had awakened something in him that he couldn't ignore. During one of his visits to the hospital, Sarah noticed that Thomas seemed preoccupied despite the good news about her recovery. "What's troubling you?" she asked, knowing her husband well enough to recognize when he was wrestling with important thoughts. Thomas sat beside her bed and took her hands in his. "I've been thinking a lot about what Prince George did for us and about what true service really means," he said slowly. "For 15 years I've stood guard protecting the royal family, and I've been proud of that service. But I never really felt like I was making a difference in individual lives until I saw how much that young boy's kindness meant to our family." Sarah listened carefully as Thomas continued. "I keep thinking about how many other families might be struggling the way we were. People who need help but don't have anyone to notice their pain or speak up for them. I want to do something more direct, something that helps people the way Prince George helped us." "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked, though she suspected where his thoughts were leading. Thomas had been researching various ways he could transition his skills into civilian service that would allow him to help families facing crises. "There are organizations that help military families deal with medical emergencies, financial hardships, and other challenges," he explained. "I could use my experience to help coordinate support for people who are going through what we just experienced." The idea had been growing in Thomas's mind for days. He had contacted several charitable organizations that focused on helping military and emergency service families during times of crisis. His background as a Queen's Guard, combined with his personal experience navigating a family medical emergency, made him an ideal candidate for several positions that would allow him to help others while building a new career. "The Royal British Legion has offered me a position helping to coordinate support for military families facing medical crises," Thomas told Sarah. "It would mean leaving the Queen's Guard, but it would allow me to work regular hours so I could be home with you and Emma every evening, and the work would be directly helping people who are struggling the way we were." Sarah squeezed his hands and smiled. "I think Prince George's gesture affected you even more than it affected us," she said. "You've found your calling, haven't you?" Meanwhile, at Windsor Castle, Prince George had been asking his great-grandmother about Guard Wellington. The young prince had noticed that Thomas seemed happier during his recent shifts, standing a little straighter and even offering the slightest smile when he thought no one was looking. George was pleased that his gesture seemed to have helped, but he remained curious about how the guard was doing. The Queen had been discreetly keeping informed about Thomas's situation through Colonel Morrison. She learned about Sarah's improving health, the family's relief from financial stress, and Thomas's growing interest in transitioning to a new form of service. The Queen found herself impressed by how her great-grandson's simple act of kindness had created such positive momentum in the Wellington family's life. Thomas made his decision, after a long conversation with Emma, who was finally able to return home now that her mother was recovering. His 8-year-old daughter's excitement about having Daddy home for dinner every night and being able to help take care of Mommy convinced him that this was the right path for their family. He requested a meeting with Colonel Morrison to formally submit his resignation from the Queen's Guard. This was not an easy conversation, as Thomas had genuinely loved his service and deeply respected his commanding officer. Colonel Morrison was sorry to lose such an exemplary soldier, but he understood Thomas's reasoning and respected his decision. "Guard Wellington," Colonel Morrison said, "your service has been exemplary, and you're leaving for all the right reasons. The Queen's Guard is losing a fine soldier, but the civilian world is gaining someone who will make a real difference in people's lives." Thomas decided that before he officially left his position, he wanted to write a letter to Prince George thanking him for the gesture that had changed everything for his family. This was highly unusual, as guards typically had no direct communication with members of the royal family. But Colonel Morrison agreed to help facilitate the delivery of Thomas's letter. The letter was simple but heartfelt. Thomas wrote about how the young prince's kindness had not only helped his family through their darkest time, but had also inspired him to find a new way to serve others. He described how Prince George's example of noticing and caring about someone's pain had motivated him to dedicate his life to helping other families facing similar challenges. "Your Royal Highness," Thomas wrote, "you are only 8 years old, but you have taught me more about true leadership and service than I learned in 15 years of military training. Your kindness saved my family, but more than that, it showed me how I can spend the rest of my life serving others in a way that makes a real difference." When the Queen read Thomas's letter before deciding whether to share it with Prince George, she was moved to tears. Here was proof that her great-grandson's natural compassion was already having a profound impact on the world. She realized that this letter would be precious to George, showing him the real-world impact of his kindness. The stage was now set for Thomas's final day as a Queen's Guard and his transition to a new life dedicated to helping others, a change inspired entirely by the compassionate heart of a young prince who had noticed one man's pain and chosen to act on it with extraordinary grace. Thomas Wellington's final day as a Queen's Guard arrived with the same spring sunshine that had witnessed Prince George's life-changing gesture just 1 month earlier. As he put on his red uniform and bearskin hat for the last time, Thomas felt a mixture of emotions: sadness at leaving a position he had held with such pride, excitement about his new role helping military families, and overwhelming gratitude for the events that had led him to this moment. Colonel Morrison had arranged for a small, private ceremony to mark Thomas's departure from service. This was unusual for an individual guard's resignation, but the circumstances surrounding his decision had moved everyone involved. The Queen had personally approved this recognition of Thomas's exemplary service and his reasons for leaving. Prince George had been invited to attend the ceremony, and he arrived with his great-grandmother, dressed in his best clothes and carrying something special. The young prince had worked with the castle's craftsmen to create a small wooden plaque with an engraved message of thanks. It was his way of acknowledging Thomas's years of service to his family. As Thomas stood at attention for the final time, Colonel Morrison read a commendation from the Queen, recognizing his 15 years of devoted service. "Guard Wellington has exemplified the highest standards of duty, honor, and dedication," the colonel read. "His service to the crown has been distinguished not only by his professional excellence, but by his personal character and integrity." When Colonel Morrison finished the formal commendation, something unprecedented happened. The Queen stepped forward and addressed Thomas directly, speaking words that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. "Guard Wellington," she said in her clear, dignified voice, "your service has protected not just the crown, but the values that the crown represents. You have shown us that true nobility comes not from birth or title, but from character and compassion. Your decision to dedicate your life to helping other families honors us all." Thomas felt tears welling up in his eyes as he maintained his final salute. Then Prince George stepped forward, holding the wooden plaque he had helped create. The young prince looked up at Thomas with the same earnest expression he had worn during their first encounter. "Mr. Wellington," Prince George said formally. "Thank you for keeping my family safe for so many years. I know you're leaving to help other families now, and I think that's really brave. I hope we can still be friends." Thomas accepted the plaque from Prince George, and as he looked down at the young prince's sincere face, he made a decision that surprised everyone present, including himself. He knelt down so that he was at eye level with the 8-year-old boy who had changed his life. "Your Royal Highness," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion, "you saved my family with your kindness, but more than that, you taught me what it really means to serve others. I promise you that I will spend the rest of my life trying to help people the way you helped us." Prince George smiled and, without any prompting from protocol, extended his hand to shake Thomas's hand. It was a gesture between equals, between two people who understood the importance of helping others. The handshake lasted only a moment, but it sealed a bond of mutual respect that would last forever. Thomas then did something that no one expected, including himself. He reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew the hand-drawn card that Prince George had given him a month earlier. He had carried it with him every day since receiving it. "Your Royal Highness," Thomas said, "I would like to return this card to you, not because I don't treasure it, but because I want you to know that your message has been received and acted upon. You wrote that I don't have to be strong all the time, and you helped me learn that asking for help and accepting kindness is also a form of strength." Prince George looked at his own card, remembering the care he had put into every word. Then he gently pushed it back toward Thomas. "You should keep it," the young prince said. "It's not really my card anymore, it's yours. And maybe when you help other families, you can tell them that someone cares about them too." The Queen watched this exchange with profound emotion. She was witnessing her great-grandson demonstrate wisdom and compassion that many adults never achieved. More than that, she was seeing the real impact that one person's kindness could have on another's entire life trajectory. As the ceremony concluded, Thomas removed his bearskin hat and handed it to Colonel Morrison, symbolically ending his service as a Queen's Guard. But instead of sadness, he felt a deep sense of purpose and gratitude. Prince George's gesture had not only helped his family through their crisis, but had shown him a new path to serve others. 6 months later, Thomas was thriving in his new role with the Royal British Legion, where he had already helped coordinate support for dozens of military families facing medical and financial crises. He often told these families about a young prince who had noticed one guard's pain and chosen to act with extraordinary compassion. Sarah had made a full recovery and returned to her work as a nurse, inspired by her own experience to specialize in helping patients and families navigate medical challenges. Emma had grown into a confident, happy 9-year-old who loved telling her friends about the day a prince gave her daddy a special card. Prince George, now 9 years old himself, continued to demonstrate the same natural empathy and leadership that had moved Thomas Wellington to tears. The Queen often reflected on that day, knowing that she had witnessed something truly special, the moment when her great-grandson's character had been revealed in all its beautiful simplicity. The wooden plaque that Prince George had made for Thomas hung in his new office, where it served as a daily reminder that the smallest acts of kindness can create the most profound changes. And in Thomas's wallet, carefully preserved, was the hand-drawn card from an 8-year-old prince who had seen his pain and chosen to respond with love. The story of Prince George's silent gesture had become legend among the staff at Windsor Castle, proof that true royalty is measured not by crowns or titles, but by the size of one's heart and the willingness to use one's position to lift others up. It was a lesson that would guide Prince George throughout his life, and a moment that had changed Thomas Wellington's world forever.